globally understanding your responsibilities as an investigator at Ohio State. So without further ado, we want to leave some time at the end for questions. So I'm going to hand it over to my friends Carly and Ben.
All right. Thanks very much, Lauren. So I think that we can start just by outlining what we want to talk about today. So I'll be getting things started discussing outside activities and conflicts of interest in research. We have quite a few slides on that topic, and I would invite interjections, questions, comments along those lines. And then I will hand things over to Carly Taylor to discuss foreign influence and global engagements. And then we'll also provide our contact information and a big list of resources, which we can circulate these slides, I assume, Stuart, to the attendees so everyone can have access to those resources.
Yes, you may.
So to start, we just want to define what an outside activity is. We're talking about something that's performed outside of Ohio State, but is related either to your scientific expertise or your job here at OSU. And these activities could be paid, they could be unpaid. And really importantly, this last bullet point, we're excluding from the definition of an outside activity the sorts of professional service that is expected of faculty members. And we'll get into those definitions a little bit more in a moment. Examples of outside activities, kind of the textbook case would be advising, consulting, or speaking, usually for industry, serving on a scientific advisory board, for example. Another outside activity would be a situation where you personally receive reimbursement or sponsored travel. So again, that would be a situation where the money goes in your pocket, or it's paid to you personally, as opposed to travel that you may do on OSU's dime or as part of a sponsored project at OSU. The other big category would be entrepreneurship and engagement of university faculty with startup companies. Also foreign affiliations, and then any other form of outside employment that you might have. So again, those are the outside activities. Excluded from that are these categories of expected professional service. So when you look at this list, this should reflect, again, the expected work of a university faculty member that isn't considered to be an outside activity. So this includes peer review, journal editorships, workshops and presentations with nonprofits, and seminars or lectures with federal, state, local government agency in the US. I think what we want to cover here is some of the general principles to keep in mind when it comes to outside activities and conflicts of interest, but also give you some very concrete take-home information. So we'll try to do both of those in this slide by saying that if you're going to engage in an outside activity, like consulting with industry, you'll need to obtain pre-approval from your department in college. And I'm guessing that many of the faculty on this call are in the College of Medicine, and the College of Medicine has a really good process for that pre-approval of outside work, and they do it through DocuSign. So when the college is looking at someone who wants to do outside consulting, for example, they're going to be looking at, okay, how much time does this scientific advisory board take? What's the commitment entailed with a faculty member doing this outside work? And those are the considerations they look at whenever they review and approve a consultancy. The other part is sort of the federal requirement, which is disclosure in the university's ECOI application. And the link to the form is right here. So again, this is a NIH specific regulatory requirement where we as an institution need to collect specific information about outside activities, personal relationships, personal financial interests, or affiliations that faculty may have. And the little starred item at the bottom here is our way of recognizing that these two steps here can be really confusing for faculty who might think, oh, I've gotten approval to consult, I don't need to do anything else. Or I disclosed it in ECOI. Why should I have had to get approval to do the consulting? So what we're trying to do looking forward is getting together this proposed policy and a process to simplify and streamline this for faculty so they don't have to go to multiple places to get that academic pre-approval and to meet their research requirements. Now we can get into conflicts of interest with research and give you a real textbook, simple example. So a COI in research would arise when someone's outside or personal interest, usually a financial interest, could affect the design, conduct, or reporting of university research. So we have a faculty member who receives $5,500 in consulting income from a company. And then this faculty member is also conducting an NIH-funded clinical trial at OSU. And the company that he or she consults for is also providing the study drug. This basically creates a nexus where there's at least a potential conflict of interest, because the personal financial interest that the individual has from the consultancy could be perceived to affect the research that's happening at OSU related to that company's study drug. And I mentioned perceived there because most of the time conflicts are about perception. Conflicts shouldn't necessarily be a quote unquote dirty thing or a bad thing. They're very common in academic medicine. And what we really do at the university is we manage the perception of conflicts more than actual conflicts, to speak candidly. And what we're looking at is how could a third party view this situation? And that's what we're trying to manage. Now, since the earlier example of a conflict of interest in research was sort of a clinical trial example, I wanted to highlight the fact that conflicts exist in every discipline with all types of research. So the example here is a faculty member creates a widget. This is a device to charge mobile phones wirelessly. And then the faculty member commercializes this technology through the university, licenses the IP out to a startup company, takes equity in the company, has a role with the company, and then the faculty member continues to do research at OSU on this technology. This is another situation that creates a conflict because the faculty member's financial interest as an equity holder in this startup could be perceived to affect the research that's going on at OSU on this technology. And back to human subject research. One thing to mention here is that conflict of interest issues are generally heightened when it comes to their existence in human subject studies, because basically the stakes are not only the impact on study design, the conduct of the research, the analysis, and the reporting of the research results, in a nutshell, the integrity of the research, but there are also potential or perceived risks to the rights and welfare of study participants. And this could include the effects on communicating the risks and benefits to participating in the study, or a real or perceived feeling of coercion for a participant to enroll in the study resulting from the financial interest. And there can also be perceived effects on the reporting and attribution of adverse events when it comes to conflicts. So back to the big picture, why should we care about COIs? The first bullet point here is really a values-based bullet point. Caring about conflict of interest is caring about and promoting transparency of financial interests. It's about protecting the integrity of the scientific enterprise. That's not just for the institution, but it's for the individual reputation of our researchers. And then I remember I came to this group probably in 2015 or 2016 when I first got to OSU. And I remembered starting that presentation with some Pew data talking about public trust in research institutions and in the media and in the military and in different institutions, and outlining the decline in trust in those institutions. And 5 years later, I don't think that I need to make that case with data that there's something very important to be said about promoting trust in scientific research that's needed. The other aspect about caring about conflicts would be to ensure that participants in research studies are protected. And then, of course, there's just complying with the law. Now, back to some specific things you can know about COI at OSU. The first is that we have a requirement that comes from NIH that anyone involved in the design, conduct, or reporting of research at OSU has to disclose their outside activities, financial interests, and affiliations at least annually. This happens in the ECOI disclosure application. And we have about 12,000 researchers who complete a disclosure form. For the overwhelming majority of researchers, they just do this ECOI form once a year. They disclose what they've done in the last 12 months. They're done until next year. But the twist on this is that NIH also requires updates within 30 days of changes. So you do your disclosure form, and then later in the year, you enter a new consultancy. NIH requires you go back into your ECOI disclosure form, make that update. So the short version is to say that for those researchers who are engaged in or who are engaging in new outside activities throughout the year, you can think of the ECOI as a live rolling disclosure as well. So here's the set of sort of high level tips that we put together a couple of years ago, where really the message is that you don't need to be an expert on all the COI regulations, but these are some tips that we recommend that you think about when completing your disclosure form. The first is to remember that disclosure is about transparency. And this goes with the second point here, which is to say that making a disclosure does not mean you have a conflict of interest. It just means you're making a disclosure. A few questions you can ask yourself if you're not sure about whether you need to disclose something. Is money going in your pocket? You probably have something to disclose. Are you receiving some kind of personal benefit from this outside activity, even if you're not getting money? Sounds like something to disclose. And then my favorite example, which comes directly from the scientific journals, is would I be embarrassed if someone pointed out that I didn't disclose this activity? Well, that's something you definitely need to disclose. So all that's to say, when in doubt, disclose. Basically, the statements here, look at the bold and don't talk yourself out of making these disclosures by looking at the non-bold parts. So you say, I have options in a startup company, but then you might talk yourself out of it, out of disclosing by saying, oh, it's a piece of paper, it's not worth anything. Don't talk yourself out of it. You have options in a startup, you should disclose that. The other example that I think we can get into with some of Carly's slides would be if you have an honorary appointment with a foreign university, it's something you should disclose, even if you don't do anything with them. Just make that disclosure. All right, so let's say that you've done your ECOI form and you had nothing to disclose. You had no outside activities. You submit, the form is closed, marked as complete, you're done. Of course, if you do enter a consultancy later in the year, you need to go back and update your form. If you did disclose an outside activity, then when you submit the form, you'll get an email saying your disclosure form is going to your chair for the chair's review and signature. And the reason why this happens is because NIH requires the institution, Ohio State, to review disclosures and advise whether research conflicts could exist. In other words, the individual making the disclosure can participate in decisions about whether a conflict exists, but the institution is the final arbiter over whether there is a conflict. So here's a bit more on the institutional review. What we expect chairs to look at is to see a disclosure form from the perspective of the standards of their discipline. And that can vary across colleges, but what we really want is the perspective of the chairs from their academic, professional, and scientific perspectives. Because in my office, the Office of Research Compliance, we have the regulatory expertise. We can look at things from that perspective. We don't have the expertise that the chairs do and that the units do about the standards of the discipline. And then when disclosures are significant or they may be related to research, we take those disclosures to a convened faculty committee. And that group consists of a wide variety of experts with different academic, professional, scientific, and regulatory expertise. So they would be part of the institutional review as well. So continuing down the process here, disclosure form of the faculty member goes to the chair signs, then it comes to my office, research compliance. And here's another tidbit that I think is relevant to the researchers on this call. Before you've done your ECUI disclosure form, up until the point that your chair signs it and my office signs it, that disclosure form is considered incomplete. That's basically going back to the NIH requirements that we have to conduct these reviews in a timely manner. So until the disclosure form is signed, that means that if you're looking to submit a renewal for your IRB application, or submit a new application, or set up a new grant, those transactions will be held either by ORP or by sponsored programs until the COI review is complete. So you might sometimes see emails from a sponsored program officer or from a screener in ORP to say your ECUI is incomplete, so we can't proceed with this yet. If that's ever an issue for you, you should have an email from the ECUI application saying it went to your chair. You can always contact my office and we can help get that sorted out for you.
So Ben, I'm going to jump in here. It's Cynthia. You know, what I see is I have some people who update this twice a month, 3 times a month, 4 times a month. And it's really hard for me to stay on top of it. And I've like gone in and approved it. They're trying to submit an IRB before they see that it's approved and they route it to the IRB. They put in another thing. I mean, we just get into these loops. So I would say if you know you have something that's being held for this, like, and you know you're a frequent flyer, like please stay on top of it, because I myself typically just go through as a signer once a week. I'm not like Ben, where this is like every day for him. I try to do them once a week, and then sometimes it doesn't go very well. So just thank you, Ben, for going through the process. That was helpful.
I think that's an excellent point. And another thing I can point out is that if your unit has any or thinks that your chair may need help with this, we can assign additional people to be notified whenever these disclosure forms come through. So I'm thinking of, for example, internal med gets so many of these, but the vice chair for research does a great job with it. But some of these departments get so many of these disclosure forms that will have the system notify their assistant or another person in the unit just to help keep on top of those disclosure forms coming through. So to continue on with the process, let's say the form's completely signed off on. What will happen is if you've disclosed consultancy with Pfizer, for example, then the chair and my office will sign off, and then Pfizer is going to populate as a company you've disclosed in the relevant Office of Research tools. So that would be in the Buck IRB application. And that would also be in the Office of Research profile used by sponsored programs. And what those offices do is when they're confirming that people are up to date on their compliance obligations, completing ECOI, they're also identifying potential conflicts. So if you've disclosed the relationship with Pfizer and ORP is screening your protocol and sees that it's sponsored by Pfizer and you've disclosed the conflict with Pfizer, that's something they'll identify as a potential conflict and refer to my office. That gets in the next slide here, which is about the different institutional processes and self-disclosure processes we have at OSU. So again, it's a matter of the units flagging these potential conflicts, and then the Office of Research and the protocols and proposal checks identifying whether there's overlap. We also get referrals of potential conflicts from tech commercialization when a faculty member is talking about forming a startup, and we'll have the discussion about conflicts with them at that stage. And here's some more information for the faculty. Here are the places you can disclose at OSU. So there's the ECUI form, which we've talked about. But when you're submitting a protocol in Buck IRB, there's a question about conflict of interest. If there's a potential conflict with you or a member of your study team, you can tick that box next to their name, and an ORP will notify my office. Also, when you're submitting for extramural funding on the EPA 005 form, there are questions about conflict of interest there. Any positive responses that you make to the CUI questions come to my office, and we can help review those. And then there's, the old school way. You can just contact the department, the college, or my office if you think there's an issue that should be discussed. Now let's suppose that there is a conflict with research. What do we do about it? What we'll need to do is develop a formal conflict management plan for the researcher. And most of these plans have standard elements, requirements, or restrictions. These plans are recommended by the faculty committee that I mentioned earlier, which meets monthly. And the terms of all management plans would be approved by the faculty member with the conflict, their chair, the college, whether that's associate dean for research, whoever the representative is for the college, and the CUI committee. And my office facilitates that through DocuSign. A little bit more on the details of a conflict management plan. We'll really talk about two main avenues for managing conflicts. One is transparency of the financial interest. So that would be disclosing in the informed consent document that there is a researcher with a related financial interest, disclosing to other members of the study team, and then in publications and presentations that result from the research. And transparency alone is usually adequate for managing conflicts from the benchtop all the way up to no greater than minimal risk IRB studies. So chart review, some behavioral studies. Usually transparency is adequate for managing those conflicts. When we start talking about clinical trials, greater than minimal risk research, then the management plans are a little bit more severe. So it will involve a dilution of the conflicted investigator's role in the research. So they'll still have to do all the disclosures we've talked about. But there's also a presumption that a conflicted individual should not be PI of a clinical trial. Another example to highlight here is if you're serving as national PI for an industry trial, you cannot simultaneously serve as the local site PI. And there are limited exceptions to this presumption. You would just need to obtain approvals from your unit, from the CUI committee, and from the IRB. But usually someone with a conflict in this situation would be a co-investigator on the study, and the study would be overseen by a non-conflicted PI. A couple of the other restrictions would be around recruitment and consent. So I won't actually read this, but you'll see there are limitations on recruitment and consent for conflicted investigators. This would be in a management plan. And similarly with adjudicating adverse events, there'd be another restriction around that. Basically, a conflicted investigator couldn't have the final say over the AE determinations. And I think with that, I can only cover one more thing. Okay. I think this is important for this group since NIH funds are involved. Under the federal regulations, there is a requirement that any financial conflicts of interest need to be managed by OSU and reported by my office to NIH. And that report needs to contain pretty detailed information. This is why we ask the questions we do on the disclosure form in ECUI. It's why we need to know detailed information about the value of the financial interest within dollar thresholds, or dollar ranges rather. We need to explain how this financial interest relates to the research and what we're doing to manage it. And what we want to avoid are unmanaged financial conflicts of interest, because those situations require what NIH calls a retrospective review of the data to determine if any bias occurred while the conflict was unmanaged. So when those situations happen, we work with a college to appoint a reviewer to help with that analysis. And I will pause there.
Thanks, Ben. And so again, I'm Carly Taylor with the Office of Secure Research. And the reason that Ben and I end up doing presentations together is because my area is helping investigators in their foreign engagements and foreign collaborations as it relates to their federal research. And we do investigations in our office. And because a lot of this area does focus on kind of maybe lack of disclosure or lack of conflicts of interest. So Ben's office and my office partner very closely on these issues. And so when we talk about foreign influence and what is this, because it's not that this is a new notion at all, it's just been really highlighted by the federal government the last 3 years. And so federal agencies, meaning either federal law enforcement or federal funding agencies. So these agencies have expressed a lot of concern about foreign entities that may be using academic research enterprise as an attempt to compromise our economic competitiveness and national security. So you're just hearing a lot more as far as legislation trying to be pushed through and maybe highlighting rules. So, you know, in this next bullet, again, our federal funding agencies, they've had kind of long-standing policies about, you know, what you should disclose on your biosketch or whatnot. But they're just kind of coming forward the past few years to really say, hey guys, just remember, we have these, you know, we have these expectations. And then we're seeing other agencies, for example, NIH implement maybe some new requirements coming up. And then also, again, if you read the papers, you're seeing a lot more federal law enforcement prosecuting these cases or trying to go after these cases, along with federal funding agencies. I mean, you can have the FBI looking into these cases, or let's say you have funding with NSF or NASA. They have their own agencies, the Office of Inspector General, that will come in and do their investigations as well. Next slide. So again, we really encourage investigators to make sure that you're understanding what you need to do for a particular sponsor. We so get it that, you know, this sponsor requires this and this sponsor requires this, and that they're sometimes not aligned. Apparently they're trying to be more aligned, but we really put it on the investigator to kind of understand, well, what are the sponsor's guidelines? You know, what does the funding opportunity announcement say? Am I answering all their questions correctly? Am I certifying whatever the notice of award is saying that I'm doing or not doing? And again, we highlight that, again, if you have funding from the NIH, there are new requirements coming down the chute in January that, again, the NIH is trying to make attempts for individuals and investigators to do more transparency in their disclosure activities. And so if you do have the NIH funding, we just want to make you aware of these new requirements. Also, what we're seeing is funding agencies, they really expect that you know, are going to identify, you know, your international engagements. If you have foreign affiliations, I think Ben mentioned earlier, you know, most biosketches for sponsors expect that you are listing both domestic and foreign affiliations, whether you're being paid or not. Again, if you have any foreign components, so if you're doing research outside of the US, you know, that you have indicated that, received permission by that. So we're really, really kind of focusing, when I say we, funding agencies are really focusing on, is your biosketch complete? Is your current and pending support documents complete? Next slide, please. So we're seeing the different areas that both law enforcement and our federal funding agencies are kind of focusing in on, and they're focusing in on these kind of different buckets. They're looking at peer review violations. So individuals that are responsible for doing peer reviews are maybe inappropriately sharing confidential information that they shouldn't be sharing. We're seeing diversion of intellectual property. So those that are working on technology and again, sharing that maybe inappropriately, or maybe resources that they should be, using here at Ohio State, and they may be doing that elsewhere. This huge area that we see a focus on is failure to disclose. And that is, again, investigators failing to disclose their conflicts of interest, conflicts of commitment, if they potentially have external employment arrangements that they are not disclosing to the sponsor. Another issue is, are investigators receiving maybe financial support that's overlapping with their US funding? So we may have an individual that has, for example, 3 grants and they're foreign grants. And then this person may have like 4 NSF awards. And so a funding agency may be very, very concerned about the overlap, either financial overlap or scientific overlap. And then there's the focus of individuals kind of setting up shadow labs or other parallel research activities elsewhere outside of their institution. Next slide. So we have this site, which again, one of our last slides is all these resources that we're providing. And one of the links is we have an international engagement site, and it goes through all these different things of, well, if you have this funding, this is what you should disclose. And this is what a foreign affiliation is. And I'm just providing you some examples. Here's one example. If you have an active position or affiliation, again, I mentioned this before, paid or unpaid with a foreign institution, make sure you're listing it on your biosketch. Make sure you're putting it on your ECOI disclosure. Next one, Ben. If you have a paid or unpaid consulting or advising relationship with a foreign entity, make sure you're seeking approval from your chair and dean. Make sure you're putting it on your ECOI disclosure. Next one, Ben. If you've participated in a foreign talent program, whether this is a current foreign talent program or it might be a new one, that you have to seek approval from your college or unit. You have to disclose it on your ECOI. We actually prefer, if it's a foreign talent recruitment program, that you contact our office too. There are some sponsors like Department of Energy that has really kind of come out that may not allow individuals to receive funding if they've been in a foreign talent recruitment program. And just to make sure everyone understands what these recruitment programs are, it's usually a program that's funded by a foreign entity, usually by a foreign government. They're trying to recruit scientists or students in order to then, provide so that those individuals can provide their expertise. But they've been really, it used to be an honor to receive one of these, but we've seen now the government saying, actually, there's big concerns about these foreign talent recruitment programs. A lot of times there's lots of issues with time commitment. We've seen some of these contracts, and sometimes they will say you have to give at least 6 months out of the year of your time. A lot of times you're getting paid annually, you're getting paid monthly. There's a lot of large fees associated with these. Usually they will require that you conduct research for that foreign government. So again, they're not illegal. However, legislation is trying to pass that if individuals are in a foreign talent recruitment program, then they cannot get federal funding. So we're closely watching that. But regardless, we do want to know if you are in one or you plan on being in one. Next one. And again, if you have been awarded funding from a foreign institution and it's not being routed through OSP, you need to seek approval on this. And you need to make sure that you're reporting this on your current and pending support to federal agencies. Next one. And NIH has taken a really big interest kind of in this bucket. If you are an author on publications and you're citing federal funding and you co-author with any foreign collaborators and they are citing foreign funding, you need to ensure that, you know, again, if this was from an NIH project, was the work that maybe your collaborator was doing, was that done outside of the US? And if so, make sure that you got permission for a foreign component, or make sure that you can justify what the person's role on this project was. Again, we look at publications and we are looking to see what kind of acknowledgement of funding there is, but we're finding that NIH is starting to do that, as well as NSF, because that's where they're finding a lot of issues tend to be. Next slide. So some of our compliance risks when we're doing investigations and our internal reviews that we're seeing is, again, those investigators are failing to disclose affiliations and providing complete information on their biosketch. And so that means sometimes we have to go back to the federal sponsor and provide an updated biosketch. Next one. Other support. Again, other support is all resources made available to the researcher in support of their related research endeavors. So we're seeing this as an area of concern because our investigators are not accurately reflecting what their other support is. Again, this can be resources or financial support from foreign and domestic entities. Consulting agreements, if you are conducting research as part of your consulting activities, not reporting in-kind contributions. So again, this is a big area that we see federal agencies focusing on. Next. Again, foreign component. If you are doing work outside of the United States, again, specifically NIH has you know, you have to get prior approval in order to do this. Usually when you are submitting a proposal, there's a question about if there's going to be any foreign components. But if you're in the middle of an award, please talk to your grants management specialist or your program officer about, hey, that you want, you know, you're looking at maybe, you know, sending samples to be analyzed at a lab outside of the US. And note, just because you have a conversation maybe with a federal agency about doing work outside of the US, that doesn't mean it's approved. You have to get approval, written approval on this. And then this area of export controls. So luckily in my office, we have a team of individuals that work in this area of export controls. So this has been another concern. You know, we understand that research encompasses usually, you know, collaborative efforts with foreign countries and their citizens. Therefore, there may be certain activities that are subject to federal regulations covering certain exports and destinations, and maybe even with people outside of the US. Our export control office, they have a list of, you know, restricted sanctioned companies, not companies, countries, or maybe restricted parties, or depending on, for example, I think we had someone that contacted us, they were sending, again, samples to a lab in another country, and they wanted to know, you know, was this going to be, you know, trigger any kind of export control regulation? So it's really important that if you are doing work with individuals outside the US, that you really contact our export control group to talk about what you're doing and to ensure that we're in compliance, because there can be really huge fines for if we are found that we're in violation of any export control issues. Next slide. So again, we are gonna provide this presentation to you all, but again, we have lots of resources of who to call, different links that you can find a lot of the information that Ben and I talked about. There are specific kind of things for different sponsors like Department of Energy. NASA has some restrictions. And again, it's good to know that if you're doing research with these agencies, what some of the nuances may be. Again, our international engagement site really kind of highlights the different things that you need to disclose for those different federal agencies. So I think that's it for now, but definitely open for any questions for Ben or myself.
I'm going to jump in with a question. I'm going to take the prerogative here.
Sure.
I was struck by your comment about under foreign influence, students being recruited for talent programs. Can you speak to that? That's a new twist for me.
Yeah, I mean, technically, depending, so there are so many talent programs out there. And, you know, some focus on individuals that are, you know, over 40 years old. Some are looking at, you know, younger individuals. And so depending on the talent program, it depends on who they're focused at, you know. So we do have talent programs that may be looking at individuals that are younger in their career. Wow. And maybe, you know, also something that we see as part of the talent programs is also, you'll see in the contracts that the individual has to maybe bring 3 students over to work in the lab. So we see a lot of that, of those requirements happening. So it's just, we've seen the gamut of going. And of course, they're not calling them talent recruitment programs a lot. Sometimes they will just call them, well, this is a consulting agreement, but it definitely mimics what a talent program looks like.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, I mean, that's a great lecture, but I would think that there must be some targeting of study sections. Right? Is anyone looking at that?
I'm sorry, I don't think I heard you, that there was something in the study section.
Targeting of study sections by these foreign entities, right? I mean, I would think so. Is that something that's being looked at? I hope so.
Well, NIH has definitely been focusing and on it. They have had issues. And I mean, it's just come to light of during these study sections, people more come to light of people sharing confidential information during the study section. So yes, that's, and we could, and they're kind of throwing that in a bucket of almost research misconduct too. So, but NIH is definitely sending letters to institutions regarding if they have identified something or they have a concern.
I'll just jump in quick, and I am actually going around to all the departments and talking about that because we have had some breaches in confidentiality. So most of the, as Carly mentioned, the study section stuff goes through the Office of Extramural Research at the NIH, and then they contact the institution. And we have, as an institution, been contacted and are having to follow up on that.
Other questions? Anyone feeling conflicted? There must be things that you're wondering about.
I just had a quick question about reporting a conflict of interest. So if you're a consultant on an investigator-initiated grant, and say you get paid like $500, at what point are you supposed to disclose disclose that like, is it when, as soon as the grant gets funded, when the money is sent to you, like, because, you know, from the time that the grant gets written to when, it's such a long process.
So one question about that to make sure I understand. Would this be a role where you're serving as a consultant to another institution which receives an NIH award?
Right.
Or are you, okay. And what would the engagement involve exactly when you said being a consultant on an investigator-initiated study?
Yeah, it might be that you're helping with the survey development, or you're helping, say it's a chart review study, you're helping them with their data collection form. Like, you might be the clinical expert that they need. So it could be a variety of things, but it's something self-limited, I guess.
Right. Okay.
Or not
So-
self-limited, but like limited in a chunk of time, in a small defined role.
Yeah, exactly. And I would welcome others to offer their thoughts on this. But my initial read is that that type of work, on the one hand, it sounds like a professional service activity, but more importantly, under the NIH regulations, they typically exclude from the definition of something requiring disclosure activities with other U.S. institutions of higher education. So this, in my opinion, wouldn't necessarily require disclosure, but of course it wouldn't be a problem if you did disclose it. And I'd welcome any other comments on that, but that's my read.
I would, at least speaking for my college, I would expect to see an external consulting form filed, which has to do more with your time and effort as opposed to your finances. I'll just throw that out there because you're working on behalf of another institution at that point, which is fine, and it's expected professional activity. But I think certainly here, and I would at least check with your chair, we expect our faculty to report that.
And I think it would get trickier too if that engagement would constitute your involvement in human subject research, for example, because if you got added on to another protocol, another institution, that's something we would normally do through OSU rather than personally, and we would have an interinstitutional agreement between OSU and the other academic institution.
So Ben, let me ask you, because this seems to be coming up in different faculty meetings. So if you are engaging in something that would be expected professional duties, but it's maybe with a company or an entity outside of the US, it's understood that, well, you would disclose that on your ECOI. Would you need to get your chair and dean approval for something outside of the US?
Yeah, and that's a tricky question that I think may depend on the exact circumstances. Usually the safest bet is if it's a foreign engagement, it's a good idea to have it approved by the college. There could be gradations to that, to be fair. Under the current policy, there aren't institutional teeth there to say that you have to get that pre-approved by the college as consulting. But I think that it's worth discussing with your chair on an individual basis, where if they don't think a formal consulting submission is required, at least having an email exchange documenting that you're going to be doing this work may be appropriate, but it might depend on the circumstances. That's a tough question. I'm sorry, I can't give a super clear answer.
I know that is, I think that's just a question people want to know, like, okay, well, we know probably, let's disclose this on ECOI for everything, but the actual approval from chair and dean, because for example, I think Ben, as you were saying, yeah, if you were doing something for the University of Texas and getting paid by the University of Texas, again, that's one of your, kind of expected professional responsibilities or whatnot. But yes, if you were reviewing a faculty member for some kind of entity outside of the US, or you were evaluating a site outside the US and getting paid, We've just, definitely have questions about that. But I mean, I know Ben would agree is, yeah, for us, we think you should disclose anything you're doing outside of the US, just because we are dealing with these federal agencies, both law enforcement and the federal sponsors. And they really do want to know of, okay, what did the investigator disclose? Does the institution know about this? Did the institution approve this? So I think definitely when in doubt, disclose these activities.
And
I will,
over.
I was just going to say, so I actually review those for the College of Medicine prior to Dean Bradford. And I will say that the dean is very involved and wants to know anything in particular that's international in flavor. So make sure that you are properly disclosing those, because I'm involved in something now of someone who didn't, and you don't want to be there.
Well, related to this, there's a question, maybe you have a very specific instance that might involve people international. What about US versus international seminars and speaking?
So that's considered, oh, I shouldn't answer.
No, go ahead, Lauren.
So that's considered part of your expectations as a faculty member. Obviously, we all want to, attain international recognition, and there's no better way than being asked to give a talk in an international place. Just disclose it, because most likely your travel will probably be covered. And so you'll want to disclose that. But don't forget also to disclose on the ECOI. So there's the ECOI, and then it's really not external consulting. So as long as you're the only ones who are really encouraged to disclose, say, travel for external consulting are administrators or those considered sort of leaders, where they are encouraged to disclose everything. And Ben, correct me if I'm wrong here, but really with this, you would just want to disclose with the ECOI.
Well, so Lauren, I'll say in my college, my dean wants to know where the faculty are if they're overseas. So we ask everybody to fill out a external consulting if they're going to be traveling out of the US, and there's payment involved so that we know where they are.
Yeah.
And to make sure that they're not spent, because I've heard of cases of people way exceeding the 20% allotment for external work by like traveling a big chunk of the year. So this is a way to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, the issue with the College of Medicine is they require the OSU IP addendum, and that's difficult to get for traveling. You can just attach it unsigned.
Right.
That's fine. And it's more of just a notification as opposed to requiring, follow-up, etc.
I just had a question about conflicts. If someone is actually, say, writing a book that has absolutely no relevance to what they do at the university, for example, does that have any implications? Do you have?
So I think if you look back, one of Ben's first slides said related to your role at the university, and that's always the first question I ask myself. So for an example, I had a faculty member who teaches here a lot, who went to another country to teach a course. We hired this person to teach courses, right? So that needs to be disclosed here because that's related to their role here. If they're doing something completely independent of their role here, I had somebody who wanted to design dresses, I think, or something, and filed IP. We're not the school of fashion, so it's like I don't care, and yay for you. And I probably would buy one, but you don't need to disclose it. And if you're not sure, ask. If you're not sure if it's related to your role, it's always good to it's better to ask. I guess that's the one key theme that I heard today was ask a lot of questions if you're not sure.
Yeah, I agree, Cynthia, because it's better to figure out all this stuff in the beginning, whether you think you're going to have a conflict of interest on a research project and start having those discussions, or you don't know if you should disclose something or whatnot, just because we don't want to be in a situation later that we're trying to have to justify our rationale after the fact.
Great. Well, thank you, Carly, and thank you, Ben. I really appreciate it. This was very informative. And I think what's really exciting is a lot of these processes and policies are unfolding as we speak. So the foreign stuff 5 years ago, would not have been as scrutinized as present day. I think that's a fair thing to say. So, we're living history as we know it. And it's good that we're in such capable hands.
Well, thank you. And definitely reach out to Ben and I if you have any questions.
Yep. Looking forward to getting the slides. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll
Thank
see
you.
you on our next meeting, Carly and Ben.